So thanks for coming along tonight. The discussion is on the Albanese Labor government's industrial relations legislation, two views. And we're going to lead off with Ed Cavanough, who's the Chief Executive of the McKell Institute. He's a journalist of considerable repute, having written a lot of journalism and for various papers here and overseas, but author of Divided Isles, the Solomon Islands, and the China, I can't read it, and the China Switch. That's it. Which was published by Black Ink last year and is going to be published by Manchester University Press this year. And Jessica Tinsley, Director of Workplace Relations and General Counsel at the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and she's an employer advocate and also a member of the National Workplace Consultative Committee. And so we're going to lead off with Ed, we go to Jessica, then we go to questions and discussion. Ed, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you. I might need to raise that a little bit. So there we go. How's that sound? Go with that. Folks, can I begin by acknowledging we're meeting today on the land of the Gadigal people and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. My name's Ed Cavanough. I'm the CEO of the McKell Institute. We're a public policy think tank that works with a cross-section of organisations, from unions to corporates, government departments to charities, on policy and advocacy and largely on industrial relations. And it's an honour to be here at the Sydney Institute. Gerard, thank you for having extended the McKell Institute this invitation and for all the work that you and Anne do at this institute, particularly creating such a thoughtful and civil forum for these really complicated and quite contentious debates. And thank you, Jessica, for being here too. Now, Jessica and I didn't actually know each other prior to tonight, but it's clear that you bring this formidable expertise in industrial relations into this discussion. But folks, can I cast your mind back to the eve of the 2022 election? In the weeks leading up to polling day, we heard ample criticism that the Albanese opposition was running a small target strategy, that their ambitions, if they were to take office, were too modest. And just about 2 years since that election, we now often hear the opposite from certain corners of our debate, that the Albanese government is going too far, and that they're imposing some sort of radical left-wing agenda on Australia. Now, the critics that make this point point to the government's ambitious IR agenda as the evidence. We've even been told that it's all part of a union conspiracy, laden with hidden motives and paybacks. Well, folks, I hope tonight I can alleviate some of the concerns that you may have. Now, I accept that the government's IR plans have been truly ambitious. We don't have time this evening to go through every individual change. So what I wanted to do is explore some of the most contentious aspects of the government's IR agenda, which I view as broadly representative of their approach. And I hope to explain why this agenda is not inconsistent with the broader pursuit of building a more productive, more efficient and fundamentally fairer economy for both working people, but importantly, the risk takers that employ them. But I first wanted to start here. Back in 2020, I spent a few weeks traipsing around northern New South Wales, undertaking an investigative research project. Now, I was up in the Coffs Coast, one of the most beautiful parts of our country, but until very recently, it also had a very dark underbelly. About 15 years ago, the region began uprooting its bananas, replacing them with a much more lucrative crop, which was blueberries. And as this cash crop exploded, so too did the need for fast labour. Capitalising on a very weak regulatory environment, a cluster of bad faith labour hire firms and other intermediaries popped up in town, promising farmers cheap, quick workers in time for harvest. For many of the workers, their dream working holiday soon became a nightmare. The piece rates were manipulated, set at rates that meant achieving the minimum wage was next to impossible. And after deductions were made, some workers were earning as little as $3 to $4 an hour, and I saw this firsthand. Now, one of those workers was a German man named Cavanough, living in Australia doing everything right by his visa, but being let down by gaps in a system that were being exploited by this minority of bad actors who thought correctly that they could get away with it. Now, Cavanough was one of the 9% of Australian workers in Australia that the Grattan Institute just last year estimated are earning below the minimum wage. And that's a stat that doesn't just hurt workers, of course, it also hurts the vast majority of businesses that do not do the wrong thing. Now, thankfully, piece rates have been reformed and the sky didn't fall in, contrary to claims, but other gaps do remain. And I worry that if they're not fixed, there's room for bad faith operators to do similar harm. Now, it's in this context that the Albanese government's IR agenda has been pursued, and it focuses both on plugging some of these existing gaps while also preserving the features of a competitive, efficient labour market and restoring some bargaining power to those typically without any. Now, as I said, this agenda is certainly ambitious, but it isn't all a surprise. Most of the major changes that they are fulfilling were pre-election pledges. Now, the first major change came in late 2022 with the passage of the Secure Jobs Better Pay Act. Now, that saw quite a few changes. Changes to flexible work, pay secrecy, the abolition of the ABCC. But I think the most significant, certainly, of that bill was the expansion of what they call multi-employer bargaining. Now, effectively, this change expanded the ability of unions and workers to negotiate with more than one business at a time across industries, helping to achieve outcomes across highly disaggregated but also very low-paid sectors like the care economy. Now, one of the main arguments at the time against multi-employer bargaining was that it would both destroy jobs and lower pay. Well, it was passed 18 months ago, and the opposite has since eventuated. And I think the unfulfilled warnings that we saw during the debate on multi-employer bargaining is predictive of some of the outcomes that we expect to see with some of the more recently legislated changes. Now, I want to focus mainly on a few of the contentious pieces of the Closing Loopholes Bill, which was passed in 2 tranches over this summer. Now, this bill admittedly did a lot. It expanded delegate rights, right of entry for union officials, formalised definitions of employees and casuals, addressed unfair contract terms, and did much more. But I want to highlight and talk through 3 specific changes that I feel reflect the government's broader mission. Now, the first is same job, same pay. Ahead of the 2022 election, Labor committed to legislating the principle of same job, same pay, responding to the growing use of labour hire as a means by some employers, mainly a handful of large corporate employers, to avoid EBA conditions their direct employees were working under. Now, I want to be clear, I've got nothing against labour hire whatsoever. It can play a critical role, especially where short-term labour and specialist skills are required for a firm that doesn't have them. But few can genuinely concede that labour hire wasn't being used by a handful of companies, primarily to drive down wages. Now, Qantas famously created their own labour hire firms. They were subsidiaries of Qantas, through which they'd orient some new hiring, then contract labour from those firms at pay grades lower than their own established EBAs. Now, does anyone really think that's fundamentally fair, or being done in good faith, or being done to meet a genuine skill gap within Qantas? So I think it's clear in that case we had a problem. Now, when Labor did commit to this change, soon came, I think, quite a disingenuous scare campaign. We were told the bill, for example, would mean that employers could no longer reward good performing workers and recognise experience. But that was an interpretation that intentionally mischaracterised the title Same Job, Same Pay. Now, I think one of the reasons the crossbench never passed this bill was because they saw through some of that argument. Now, this bill does nothing to prohibit any employer rewarding expertise. It doesn't change EBAs themselves, and it doesn't change anything automatically. Any worker or union still has to make a claim to the Fair Work Commission if they believe labour hire is being misused. What it does do is create a check on mainly large companies exploiting labour hire simply to lower their wages bill. Now, I began by telling a story of Cavanough, the German backpacker who was getting paid just $3 an hour. Now, for the first time, the Closing Loopholes Bill treats intentional, systematic wage theft with the seriousness it deserves. It strengthens financial penalties, but it also imposes a new criminal sanction in the most egregious cases. And I'm glad that under the weight of growing evidence about the prevalence of wage theft in our economy, most of the traditional opponents to action on this area of policy have actually conceded that action is required. There has been, though, at times, I think, unrealistic scare campaigns on wage theft too. I've heard arguments, for example, in this latest round that the bill would potentially punish small businesses whose payroll systems genuinely malfunctioned. But the bill doesn't do that, and no court would view a genuine technical glitch as means or cause for criminal sanction. What it does do is punish and deter intentional underpayment. We need these laws, not just to protect workers like Cavanough, but to protect the vast majority of businesses that would never underpay their workers. Now, what I want to spend actually more time talking through is the very significant changes to gig work and the regulatory approach that the government has taken. And I want to do that because I genuinely believe this is one of the most significant reforms that the government has done since winning power. Now, its introduction of basic regulations and protections for gig economy workers is genuinely world-leading. And it's a pragmatic response to the gigification of work. It's an approach that accepts gig work exists, but disagrees that it should be a backdoor to lowering pay and conditions. Now, critics of these changes claim this reform approach is radical, and that by granting the Fair Work Commission powers to set minimum standards for regulated workers on these platforms, the entire contractor-employee dichotomy is being upended. But my contention is this: the government aren't the ones that upended that dichotomy. It was the gig economy proponents who fired the first shot. And the government's response is an inevitable response to a type of insecure work that was imposed upon our labour market by distant venture capitalists in San Francisco, whose claim to be true innovators, in my view, stands on very shaky ground, because the great innovation of gig economy providers is not about their services, but it's in the mainstreaming of a form of work that skirts established labour laws and often the most basic of workplace rights. Now, this is nothing to celebrate. Gig economy work is often a form of work which a quarter of its participants routinely earn below the minimum wage, and of which all of the risks associated with working are borne solely by the worker. And we get told, don't worry, this is just, gig workers are just side hustlers, but the data shows that that's not the case. This is often their job. And it's a job that has no benefits. It's a job with no workers' compensation. It's a job where, in the most terrible of cases, if you die at work, which is the case for 14 workers tragically in Australia in this gig economy, your family's often subjected to lengthy court proceedings just to get compensation. And the gig economy platforms themselves are often completely AWOL in this process. So this is a deeply impersonal form of employment. It's a relic of the past that's being rebranded as a model for the future. And it's moving from rideshare to healthcare, cleaning to marketing and beyond. And the idea that any responsible government, let alone a Labor government, could look at this reality and not do anything, that is what would be radical. Now, I want to talk about, there's a few more aspects to this bill, of course, that I could talk about. But I want to turn to the consequences of the agenda overall, because so far much of the hyperbole that's framed the debate just hasn't materialised. Last week, we saw incredible jobs data released. We were told that the IR bills wouldn't create a single job, but the unemployment rate fell last month to 3.7%. Even my home state of South Australia recorded its lowest unemployment rate ever of just 3.2%. So, of course, certain provisions in the IR agenda are still trickling through, but I'm yet to see a serious impact on jobs. And meanwhile, real wages have started to grow. Inflation has moderated, and many of the larger businesses in our economy are recording record profits. So that doesn't look like the dystopia that we've been warned about. There is, though, an elephant in the room, and that is productivity. Now, one of the major criticisms of this IR agenda overall is that it will further weaken labour productivity in Australia. And it's true that our productivity is in a dismal state. But to fix it, we need to look at productivity holistically and understand that the government's efforts to provide basic workplace protections isn't inconsistent with an agenda we need to see if we were to enhance labour productivity in Australia. We need to accept that it's not just the productivity numbers that matter, but the way in which we achieve those numbers. There are two roads towards better labour productivity, in my view. The first is a lower road, a path that squeezes productivity out of our workforce, chasing greater output with the twin sticks of insecurity and gigification. But achieving productivity through this approach would be a Pyrrhic victory. It would improve living standards for some while making working lives harder for others. So my preference is that we take a higher road towards a more productive economy. And this path would tackle productivity by addressing all of its determinants. I want to see a productivity agenda that doesn't discard the best features and protections of our IR framework, basic protections like sick leave, workers' compensation or superannuation, but instead works to modernise these institutions so they can apply flexibly to the dynamic nature of a modern economy. I want to see flexibility in the jobs market achieved not by worsening job insecurity, but by dismantling employer-driven rigidities, like the excessive use of non-compete clauses and making entitlements like sick leave more portable. I want to see a productivity agenda that leverages competition policy to drive firm-level innovation and that more aggressively invests in the skills of workers. And I want to see this achieved with a renewed sense of collaboration and far less vitriol in our industrial relations debate. Now, younger voices such as Jessica's and mine, we have the luxury of not being beholden to the tired old tropes of the past. We don't need to rail against the activities of union thugs, nor do we need to treat bosses with an innate suspicion or an unfound animus. There's a middle path, and it's a path that brings people along for the journey, creates a level playing field for all businesses, and increases living standards. And that is a path I believe the government's IR agenda is consistent with. So I look forward to the conversation. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Ed. Jessica.
Thank you. Hello. Push it on. There we go. Knock me out in a moment. There we go. Okay. Hi. So I too would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we meet this evening and pay my respect to elders past and present. So, of course, I'd like to thank Jared and Anne and the Sydney Institute for inviting me to speak and for hosting this evening. Of course, as well, thank you to my sparring partner, Ed. Although, as Ed has said, we haven't met before this evening. We have. I am aware of his work in the wage underpayment space and have been quite impressed with that work. We know that good employers don't deliberately underpay their staff, so work that's done in that area is very important. As I said, these evenings are always so much more fun when you have a sparring partner. Although I'm a little bit self-conscious that I don't have a published book or any sort of book, so there we go. And of course, thank you for all of you for coming out this evening. I've got a bit of a potentially broken toe, so if I start wobbling a little bit, don't fear, I should get good again. So I started the Australian Chamber a few months into this first term of government, and as an industrial relations practitioner, it certainly kept me quite busy. So first of all, we had the Jobs and Skills Summit. Then we quickly raced into consultation for the Secure Jobs Better Pay legislation, which was swiftly rushed through Parliament. We then had the lower profile Protecting Worker Entitlements legislation. And then most recently, we've had the contentious Closing Loopholes #1 and then #2. So it's quite remarkable, really. In less than 2 years, the Albanese government has rewritten nearly every single part of the Fair Work Act. So if you put these together, he has expanded the size of the Fair Work Act by approximately 540 pages. So when we started at something that was only 1,000 pages, we're talking about a 50% increase to our workplace legislation in under 2 years, which is quite remarkable. So at the Australian Chamber, we've been here in the trenches the whole time, consulting with government, working with our members, working with the opposition, working with other business groups, and lobbying the crossbench. So tonight is a really good opportunity to rise above all that, look back, and really ask, what has been the point? What is the purpose of the Albanese government's IR agenda, and how will it change our workplaces? So the government tells us, and as Ed's echoed in some parts in his own speech today, these laws are about getting wages moving again. We've all heard these. Ending so-called job insecurity, closing loopholes that allegedly allow employers to undercut wages. It's a tidy narrative and it's an effective narrative, isn't it? But if you look past the slogans, you'll see that the primary purpose of the government's IR legislation is essentially to give trade unions more relevance. This is not to say that the government isn't genuine in its desire for higher wages and better conditions for workers. It's just they believe that these aims can only be achieved when you elevate the position of trade unions. We know that trade union membership has plummeted from 41% in 1992 to about 12.5% in 2022. So this accounts for only 8% of private sector employees, which the Fair Work Act primarily relates to. So if your worldview is that conditions can only be improved when trade unions are strong, then this downward trend is truly depressing, and in need of urgent action to fix, which is where the government's IR laws come in. Having spent hours plowing through various iterations of these laws, it's clear that they create what I like to describe as a union paywall. So to the extent that there are wins for workers in these laws, they are difficult to access unless you are a member of a union. Want the benefits of the legislation? Well, it's simple. Join your union. Now, I'm no union basher, as Ed has touched on. I think we're a younger generation. We're not beholden to the same sort of idealistic sort of punching between the two sides. But, you know, trade unions clearly have a role in our system. There are cost-effective ways to employees to access advice and advocacy, but a union paywall, it's inherently unfair and impractical. How can laws which effectively lock out 92% of private sector employees from their benefits be good for workers? Tonight, I want to explore this theory more. I would like to walk you through the highlights or the lowlights of the laws as I view them. And once you're convinced, as I am, of the existence of this so-called union paywall, I'll point out the impact this is having and will have on our workplaces, including on productivity and wages, on complexity and compliance, and on flexibility and fairness. Ed said that he wanted to alleviate your concerns. Well, I'm here to bring them back again. So what evidence is there of a union paywall? Essentially, it's threefold. First of all, there are special rights provided especially for unions and new rights for employees which can only be effectively accessed on behalf of a union representative. Let's start here with the government's flagship wages policy, so multi-employer bargaining. While I believe that this policy is designed to fail in its chief aim of lifting wages growth, let's pretend for a moment that it does do that. A multi-employer agreement cannot exist without trade union involvement. Unless an employer obtains a voting request order, a single union representing only a couple of employees can veto the agreement, even where the employers and most employees support it. Similarly, if the majority of employees and the employers want out, you've got it, the union can veto that as well. So let's move to the government's same job, same pay policies. These changes have been designed to stop employees who have an enterprise agreement in place, usually a union deal, from obtaining the services of labour hire providers who are less likely to have a union deal in place. If the business with the union deal does engage labour hire workers at a lower rate, then an order can be sought from the Fair Work Commission enforcing the primacy of that union deal. Unions that are merely entitled to represent the interests of an employee can apply for these orders, even if they don't actually represent any employees. So when the government talks of closing loopholes, we know that the loophole being closed here is the existence of labour hire providers that don't have a union deal in place. Never mind the views of the labour hire workers themselves. Other rights include expanded rights for workplace delegates, so those employees that we know are employees on site that are representing the union. These new rights allow them to access workplace facilities to undertake union work, to paid time off to undertake paid training, and much more. So from 1 July, union reps will be provided expanded right of entry rights to access work sites to investigate suspected employer non-compliance. So second, these laws give unions greater access to non-traditional workers, and Ed touched on this a lot in his speech. So here we're thinking gig workers. The government's employee-like changes go much further than just rideshare and food delivery, which has often been what the public and what the media is really focused on in this space. It will potentially impact many other forms of independent contractors who advertise their services online. So while we supported the provision of minimum standards to rideshare and food delivery workers only, the government has failed to provide clarity on what these minimum standards could be. So they're delegating this responsibility and this discretion to the Fair Work Commission. This highly complex process will be impossible for workers to navigate themselves. So leaving their case to be made by, let's just say, the Transport Workers Union or others like it. Collective agreements can also be made that cover gig workers, but again, only a union can apply for one of these agreements. So if you're a rideshare driver and want to say over the standards that will apply to you, what do you need to do? Join a union. So the government's IR laws have also placed significant practical restrictions on employers engaging non-permanent workers such as casuals, who are essential for an effective and fair labour market. but are also far less likely to be a union member. So reduce these types of worker, the union theory must go, and you'll boost the number of full-time permanent workers. But we know it's not that simple, and these laws risk exacerbating existing workforce shortages. So finally, the IR laws are riddled with complexity. Complexity makes IR laws inaccessible to employees without the support of a lawyer, or you guessed it, a union rep, creating a barrier for most employees in accessing many of the benefits that they would otherwise receive, the so-called benefits they'd otherwise receive under the Albanese government's IR laws. So the recent changes to casual employment laws, for instance, move away from a simple test where essentially you've got a contract and the contract will reflect the understanding between the casual and the employer that, hey, they're a casual. It changes it to a very confusing legalistic definition spread across 4 pages. If I could give everyone some homework, honestly, go home and have a look at it and tell me if you can, I'm sure you're a very educated group of people here tonight. Go and have a look at it. It's impossible to navigate. While the government talks up its increased rights for casuals to convert to permanency, it requires a casual to prove that they don't meet this very confusing 4-page definition. So spare a thought for the poor employee trying to navigate this system alone. Another source of frustration for employees and employers alike is a significant increase in discretion provided to the Commission. Instead of setting out rights and obligations clearly on the face of the legislation, or in fact leaving individual employers to negotiate with their own workforces, the government has effectively delegated decision-making to the Commission, both their own and also moving a lot of the decisions that previously employers would be able to make for themselves, again, to the Commission. So the Commission, we know, is a natural playground for the union movement with its complex processes and legalese, which again delivers us another brick for the union paywall. So my speech tonight is really not meant to be an ideological attack on the union movement. I'm less focused on what benefits are being provided to unions of themselves. Rather, I'm more concerned with the kind of IR system we have been left with as a result of this push. So what are the consequences of a system which seeks to alleviate the role of the union movement? Well, as a result of these changes, we have a system that has more conflict, it is more complex, it's more rigid, and it's one which shifts decision-making, again, away from the workplace where decisions should be made to the Fair Work Commission. And what are the consequences of this? Conflict is the opposite of harmonious workplaces. Complexity breeds non-compliance. What's the point of enhanced workplace rights and obligations if your employer doesn't understand them and unintentionally doesn't comply with them? Inflexibility in our workplaces, brought on particularly by restrictions to casual employment and the so-called new right to disconnect, will particularly hurt women and those with caring responsibilities who have thrived in our modern flexible workplaces. The Reserve Bank, the Fair Work Commission, the Productivity Commission, the Treasury Department are all substantial institutions in this country that have recognised the link between higher wages and productivity. And yes, I know Ed knew I was going there. Yet the government appears determined to continue our productivity growth decline by making our workplace relations system more rigid and returning us to a form of centralised wage fixing, including but not limited to by moving enterprise bargaining away from the enterprise level, focusing more on sector-wide agreements, by reintroducing compulsory arbitration. All hallmarks of an antiquated system overhauled by the Hawke and Keating governments in favour of productivity-boosting enterprise-level bargaining, which is where we really should be staying. So, in conclusion, it's safe to say that the view you've received from me tonight on this side for the Albanese government's IR laws is rather bleak. So let me be clear, the full impact of these laws won't be felt for years. I urge you to ignore the cheap arguments around, see, the world hasn't fallen in, pushed by the government and its proponents. The purpose of the IR laws are to put up a union paywall, to return Australian workplaces to a time when union membership sat closer to 40%, the 1970s and 1980s, a time when our workplaces looked more male, more blue collar and more rigid. Our workplaces have moved on, so our workplace laws should too. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thanks very much to our speakers for informative speech, for sticking to the time. So we've got plenty of time for questions and discussion. So if you both come up here and stand, you can share the microphone. I'll lead off. Just stay close and remember, talk down to the back of the room. So I'll just start off with both of you. The issue of productivity, which you both dealt with. Now, I think it's fair to say that that the coalition in government didn't do anything to IR in the wake of the work choices problem of the Howard government towards the end. And so the current IR system is essentially that of the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd government, plus now the Albanese government. Now, since the coalition didn't do anything in this area, there's been about, a 15-year gap or 10-year gap, a bit more than 10 years, and productivity hasn't gone anywhere. I mean, I think it's about the level where it was in 2016. So why is that the case? If the IR system's working well, why is nothing happening with productivity, since it's all essentially the Labor government's legislation over, not Hawke-Keating, but over Rudd-Gillard, Albanese? Start with you.
Yeah, sure. Well, as I mentioned in my remarks, I mean, there's more to Labor productivity than just IR. I mean, I wanted to see more flexible entitlements, more investment in skills and training. We haven't seen a lot of that. I think what worries me about talking about the gig economy and stuff purely in a framework of productivity is that if we go down that path where we just gigify everything, then technically maybe we have higher labour productivity as per the data, but the consequence is really significant for people at work. So that's what my remarks were talking about. I think we need a more holistic productivity agenda that brings along some of those institutions that actually help protect workers while also modernising them, making them tailor-made for a much more modern dynamic economy. That's my view.
Thanks. So I think you've hit the nail on the head. Here? Okay. So I think you've hit the nail on the head, Jared, in terms of our productivity crisis. We know that it's not going anywhere, which is not a good thing. So in terms of where we're at now, I don't think anyone's necessarily saying that workplace relations and our workplace relations system is going to fix our productivity crisis. We know there's so many different elements to it. But what our workplace system continues to do, and has been for a long time now, is it imposes rigid requirements on employers and employees who are, for different reasons, looking for flexibility in their lives, that the union sort of pushes around, trying to reintroduce some of that rigidness that I touched on in my speech. In terms of it's putting really a handbrake on productivity. I think that's the issue. So by fixing our workplace relations system, I don't think we'll be fixing the productivity crisis, but it certainly isn't helping. And I think that we can't have a sustainable, we won't see productivity growth until we do fix some of these quite concerning issues. And I think a particular concern for me really is the multi-employer bargaining. So here we've essentially, let's call it what it is. It's an attempt for sector-wide bargaining again. We know that productivity is linked to enterprise level, where individual employers and their individual workplaces can essentially introduce terms and conditions that suit them. It's not what suits Roger and Jerry down the road with their store or their business. It's really what works for them. So that's what we need to be focusing on. Sector-wide bargaining doesn't do that. It introduces the same sets of terms and conditions across numerous different employers. And we also know that we're not going to get agreements. When you have so many different parties to multi-employer agreements, you have potentially, 5 unions, 10, 20 different employers. They're not going to agree, even amongst themselves, let alone with each other. What we'll see is more of these so-called agreements being decided through arbitration at the commission level.
I've got a question here from Ed, who says, it's not quite on the topic, but he's on the Zoom, so we've got to be fair. Now, Ed says, how does same job, same pay help create a job in Townsville where a worker can pay just over $550,000 for a house? Anyone want to delve into that? Oh, have a go. You're the McKell Institute. Have a go.
Well, same job, same pay. I mean, how will it create a job? Well, I mean, it will create job. It will stop jobs being basically. Oh, sorry, I got to move over. Yeah, my apologies. Look, my view is same job, same pay. We keep getting told it's this sort of horrific job killing proposal. I mean, the reality was there was only a handful of companies. There are only a handful of companies that are, in my view, misusing labour hire. We're seeing it a lot in the mining sector. I mentioned the quite notorious cases of Qantas, creating their own subsidiaries, hiring through them to subvert EBAs. This isn't the sort of domain of your corner stores. I mean, these are sort of these big corporations that are figuring out ways to navigate these systems in a way that ultimately benefits them and, in my view, undermines the existing EBAs that workers have struck. So I don't think it's going to be a job killer. And I think, frankly, since it's been passed, we haven't seen any signals of that yet. So that's my general perspective on same job, same pay.
Sure. So in terms of, the short answer is no, it's not going to create a single job. I think a key problem with the labour hire changes is that it's a certain level of arrogance that the labour hire workers themselves, and let's be honest, they're the people that are receiving these. That's the pay and conditions that we're talking about. It's this idea that what they've negotiated or what they've struck with their own employer, i.e. being the labour hire provider, isn't good enough and they don't really know what's good for them. So what it means is that a union struck enterprise agreement on a site they happen to be working on that day for over 3 months or so, that's what they should agree to. It takes away the autonomy and the right of those labour hire workers to actually strike their own deal, to talk to their own bosses. Now, you might look at that and say, well, of course, the labour hire worker is always going to want the higher rate of pay. But I think the problem there is that study after study is showing that people in this day and age are willing to forego pay increases for other benefits, things that might go to work-life balance. So there's numerous reasons why a labour hire worker might actually prefer or be happy to negotiate a lower rate of pay than what the people they're working with on the job site for a few months gets, to offset some sort of, flexibility or something. We don't know. And I think that's the fundamental problem in my mind with this legislation is the arrogance that the labour hire workers can't strike up their own bargain.
And I raised a point about, I worked in the Industrial Relations Department 40 years ago, and then the awards were incredibly complicated, but much more so now. So on the issue of wage theft, we're talking here about two companies like the ABC and SBS. I mean, they're taxpayer funded essentially. They're not trying to make money, and they couldn't pay award rates. I mean, they couldn't get it right. So if big companies like the taxpayer funded companies like the ABC and SBS can't manage it, I mean, how difficult can it be? I mean, who can manage these structures without wage theft or overpaying or underpaying?
So, Jerry, you talk there about the SBS and the ABC. I'd like to point you to the Minister's own department. So the people that have drafted these laws, they've recently been involved in their own underpayment issues. So if the drafters of our laws can find it too difficult to comply with workplace relations or modern awards or their agreements, then how's a normal small business or a medium-sized business that's too busy running their own business to understand pages and pages of complex legalese?
Let's add to that. What the IR changes have done, which is really welcome, is that they haven't, put in a criminal sanction for mum and dad business owners making a mistake. That just does not happen. The criminal sanctions, the more extreme penalties, are for those intentional and systematic cases. And as I was saying, I've literally been in communities where these guys are getting paid $3 or $4 an hour by phoenixing contractors that roll in and out of town. They pop in and out of the country. There are a very small, but an existing minority of actors that do that in the economy. And they're now subject to criminal sanction. I think everyone can agree with that. Now, there might be some complexities, of course, in awards, and that's not ideal. You don't want that necessarily, but there are problems that we're trying to solve here. And the way, I've been on the sort of, front line of the debate about wage theft for a long time. And we often get told these sort of spurious arguments that, someone will make a mistake, they go to jail. That doesn't happen. That's not going to happen with this change. So I think the balance on wage theft has been struck in a right way.
I don't think anyone at the ABC is going to jail. They're okay.
That's probably true.
Can I just ask a question? In terms of the size of a business, we had the minister here some time ago now, and he said that if these laws will not apply... Yeah, thought I was. We understood that these laws do not apply to businesses who employ less than, say, 15 people. Is that correct?
Well, it depends which ones you're talking about there.
Right.
So I think in terms of, it really depends on which. So there's small business exemptions at different rates throughout the bill.
Right.
Now the law, which can sometimes get confusing in itself, especially the different rates. So we'd be very happy with a consistent small business exemption that has the same number. Some are 15, some are 20, 21.
Yeah.
But yeah, it really depends on
What
which
I'm saying
part.
is, if you have a business where you employ 5 or 6 people, these laws do not apply. Is that correct?
Well, no, that they will. So I talked in my speech about the quite confusing definition of casual employment, those 4 pages of that I've given you all homework to go and have a read of tonight. That applies to a small business. So, while you're trying to run in your bakery, you can go home and have the same homework as you all here tonight and read through the 4 pages and make sure that you've got your few uni students that you're employing are properly casual, because it's not entirely clear at the moment.
Yeah, I'll just briefly add to that. I mean, we're talking about, there's small business exemptions, everywhere throughout this, but things like multi-employer bargaining, not going to have, your cafe is not going to be subject to that. So, yeah, there are exemptions.
Jared's already alluded to the coalition's seeming reticence to re-enter the field of IR reform because of we all know what happened with the last big work choices debacle as it played out. The next federal election's about a year away if we look at the timetable, if the government sticks to that. Do you think that the coalition is going to offer up any meaningful sort of far-ranging opposition in the way of their own reforms to what the government's done, or are they going to be too afraid to really engage again?
Well, I'll start off. I mean, I think there will be a argument that the sum of these changes is, crushing our economy, is doing this and that. That's going to be a hard argument to make if that doesn't happen. So that's going to be an interesting conversation to watch. I would be amazed to watch the coalition come out and make a case for removing criminal sanctions on wage theft, for dysregulating the gig economy where we're seeing, a quarter of people getting paid under the minimum wage, and for that being a sort of model for the future. I mean, that's an unusual approach to take to take about. Now, I think actually a lot of these pieces of legislation have ended up passing because the campaigns against them haven't necessarily worked, because I think people see a lot of them are kind of rooted in basic principles of fairness, particularly things like same job, same pay. So, yes, this is contentious, it's complicated change, but I think broadly there's support behind these changes and we're not seeing the detrimental impacts that we've seen. So I think it'll be a brave coalition to come out swinging against every nook and cranny of the changes there.
Well, I don't speak for the coalition here, but in terms of they've been consulting quite widely on and keeping quite close to the business community in terms of, and we saw that throughout the when we've been sort of talking about and consulting with these new laws. But I think in terms of the 8 or 9 years that the coalition was in government, you'd note that for I think the whole time it was quite a hostile Senate. So I think in terms of, I think there was various attempts to get different laws through, but I think their success there really was a unfortunate consequence of the circumstances they had with the Senate that they were handed. Ed mentioned wage theft and gig as 2 potential areas that the coalition would be crazy to reject. So it'd be remiss of me not to note that wage theft was actually a coalition policy when they were trying to pass their omnibus bill a few years ago. And as for the gig economy, I think again, and I touched on this in my speech, when we talk about the gig economy, we all think rideshare food delivery. The business community has been supportive of a limited set of minimum standards for rideshare and food delivery. And I could be wrong, but I think that was also the coalition policy as well, although don't quote me on that. So I don't think there's going to be any overhaul of those laws as they relate to rideshare and food delivery. The fundamental problem with those gig changes is that it goes beyond just that. the Uber or Menulog or DD, those guys, and starts touching on really any independent contractor that uses that advertises their services online. And again, I won't give you this homework to go and have a look at this, but if you look at the fine print, it really does expand to a whole lot of range of other workers. And I think there lies the problem. We're fundamentally changing the concept of what it means to be an independent contractor, the flexibility and the choice that that brings versus an employee. So I think there might be some scope there for some changes.
Well, my remarks touched on the fact with the independent contractor changes, that was an imposition of basically the big rideshare companies and things like that. So that dichotomy has been dramatically disrupted. I mean, it's been completely disrupted. I mean, you see people working as an independent contractor, going to the same job 9 to 5, 5 days a week, wearing the same uniform, same roster forever, having to pay their own superannuation, own workers' compensation, all of this. This is metastasized throughout, this is a disruption of the independent contractor model. It's not going to be necessarily people who are genuine independent contractors in the way that you think of it that will be caught up with it. And I think the language in the provisions are clear enough that it's really targeting rideshare, those sorts of workers in digital platforms at pretty low income rates. I think it's unlikely it's going to, accidentally expand beyond that significantly. So that's generally my thoughts. Yeah.
What is your organisation hearing from independent contractors? What are they? Do you represent them, or is that another body who represents independent contractors?
So we have a range of different industry association members, for instance, in the construction space, in the housing space. So there's some real concern from their members that are large contractors themselves on the right for them to retain their role as an independent contractor. So there is that concern. There were some tweaks to alleviate some of our concerns, but they don't quite go far enough. The other point I'd make is that exact definition that example that Ed just gave in terms of, they work 9 to 5, they're paying their own super, they wear the company's uniform. I'm telling you now, before these laws came into effect, as a former employment lawyer, these issues would come up on my desk. And I'm telling you that would have always been an independent an employee. So I think that we've got a situation where, exactly as Ed laid out, they would have been classified as an employee if they went to court in the first place. So I'm not sure if that's a proper description of a gig worker or an independent contractor. I think that's really a compliance issue that would have been resolved itself under the previous laws.
Listening to Jessica, it takes me back about 30 to 40 years and what we called the centralised wage fixing economy. All of which was so disastrous in the end, especially after the period of Whitlam and Fraser, with ongoing inflation, ongoing higher wages and ongoing unemployment. It didn't work for the reasons Jessica has pointed out, that individual businesses were better off deciding a lot of what happens. And a lot of the reform came about from the Labor side under Keating and Hawke. And this was pushed by people like Peter Costello and others outside. So I wonder if, at the moment, the people who are legislators are too young to remember what happened back then and why governments like the Hawke-Keating government worked to reform the centralised wage fixing arena, because it seems to me we're going back. And Robert Gottliebsen had a very good piece in the Australian today where he pointed out how quickly we will have more inflation. You say, let's see if it works. Well, that's great. That's fine. But it didn't work in the past. And he has listed various ways in which he can see businesses will be shedding staff, using investment to prop up the business, not employing others. And in fact, if policy doesn't change in the budget, we're in for a long-term high on interest rates.
Okay, so we'll start with Ed.
I read Robert's columns. I've got to say I don't agree with every line in every one of them. He's got a remarkable capacity to see into the future, though, which is he often has in those. Look, I don't think we were moving back to a centralised wage fixing thing. You're right. I can't remember the economy of the 1970s. I was born in the 1990s, so this is before my time. But we're not moving back like that. Jared very eloquently earlier described that the IR space had largely been vacated for 10 or 15 years. There have been obviously changes. The coalition didn't do nothing, but some of the more substantive reactions to the real changes and evolutions in our economy just simply weren't being addressed. One of the consequences of that was flatlining of wages growth, was this growth of insecure work that I know is, people talk about it as a myth, but it's not a myth. There's people with, entrenched insecurity for much of their careers now. That is, in my view, a problem. And you simply need to move forward with some of these changes. I think multi-employer bargaining is controversial. It's a change for sure, but we're not going back to the 1970s. And I don't think many of the people writing the laws are sort of dusting off the statute books from the Whitlam years and trying to figure out how to recreate that those halcyon days.
So I think I touched on all the issues that you raised there before in my speech, but what I'll say about multi-employer bargaining, I think the fundamental problem with it is that it doesn't quite do what it says on the label. I think this is going to take a good 4 to 6 years to actually play out, but my bet on this is that it won't see any increase in wages, and I think that really is a fundamental issue with it. So just give me 2 seconds and I'll step this through. So like I said before, you've got a multi-employer agreement. By its very nature, you have numerous parties. You could have an unknown number of potential employers. Let's just say 15 employers, just to be a little bit modest here. You might have 4 or 5 different unions. They're going to have to negotiate amongst themselves before they go to the other side with an opening pitch. So you can see where some conflict's going to arise there. It's then going to rely on them to, and noting as well, sorry, I should start from the beginning, employers can be roped in. So they can be dragged into these negotiating, the negotiating table here. So count the fact that they don't want to be there, you can see how difficult this process is going to be. So after a few rounds, you'll have a few goes of saying, oh, well, we'll see if we can come to an agreement, come to a wage, things. And then we'll have a situation where there's no agreement, because I think people are people. I really can't see any sort of agreement being reached, which means it's going to be sped off to the Fair Work Commission. And this is where the arbitration, this compulsory arbitration factor comes in to your point. And here we'll have a situation where it is centralised wage fixing, because we're going to have the commission determine, not the parties. It's not going to be a proper agreement, which by its very word requires people to agree. It's going to be a declaration or an order that the Fair Work Commission, a completely independent umpire that doesn't have to choose one side. It's not, oh, well, I pick you over you. It's, I'm going to come up with this other third way that no one really likes and then impose that on those parties. And there, I think, is a fundamental problem. Now, to my original point, whether this will see wage increases, I don't think so. I don't see a situation where the Commission is going to set it at a rate that the smaller employers in the group can't afford. So what we'll have is a situation where the lowest common denominator, the least wealthy employer, sets the floor, and that's it. So you can see it where over time, if we have too many of these multi-employer agreements, we'll have a situation where wages will flatline. So that's really what my fundamental problem with it is. It just is not going to do what the government says it's going to do. And it's recorded if I'm wrong, so we'll see.
Do you want to make a comment there?
Oh, no.
Okay. So I've got a final question here. I have a final question here, which just really goes back to trade union power. As you know, it says, as the speakers will know, that trade union membership has never been fewer, particularly in the private sector, and yet trade union power or influence is probably more substantial than it's been for many years, because under this legislation, as under the old legislation, it says trade unions not only negotiate for their own members, but for those who are entitled to be members. So therefore, the power of the trade union movement, whilst the membership is declining, it says here, due to that factor and also superannuation, the trade union movement is becoming all the more influential as it drops so many members. So a final comment on the trade union. We started with Ed, so we'll go with Ed, and then we go with Jessica, and that's it.
Yeah, look, the truth is that trade union membership has been declining significantly for a long time. It's down at 8% in the private sector, 11% public, 13 or 12%, I think, in public sector, 11% overall in the economy. That's a problem. There's a fundamental view that some people have that unions shouldn't have the type of role that is included in some of this legislation, inspector powers, right of entry, things like that. That is viewed by many as a scary thing because of, I think, the tropes around what trade unions actually are and what they do. We have a sort of, a conservative coalition in this country where every time they get into trouble, they do break glass in case of emergency, ruffle up the trade union thug line, and then off you go. And I think it's just not reflective of what trade unions do on the ground. Now, 8% isn't great. It'd be good if it was higher. 11% isn't that great either. The reality is they're not the only organisation or the only type of organisation with that level of membership. When you look at peak body memberships, trade association memberships of businesses, it's about 10 or 11% as well. You wouldn't argue that peaks like ACCI and others shouldn't be contending for the broader benefits of the business community. Unions are in the same boat. So I think the idea around sort of entrenching their power through this legislation is a bit, they have a role to play, but I wouldn't be so alarmist as what we've heard.
Thank you. I'd say that the fundamental, and like I said before, I'm not a union basher. I think that unions do have a role. I think they're forgetting what their role is the fundamental issue. So 8%, it's not great, but if you were at their core, they're service providers. So over the years, they're losing, let's just call them what they are, they're customers. I'm from an employer organisation. If we're losing members and having the same sort of issues, not to the same extent as unions, but we rejig our services and we ask them, well, what is that you want from us? I think instead of having a sort of a look inward and saying, well, why aren't people attracted to the services I'm providing? They use the money to funnel into political campaigns to boost their side in Parliament. So I think in terms of the issue with this legislation, it's a consequence of that. So instead of going out and thinking, well, maybe we should stop, we shouldn't organise so much, maybe what would provide our members better services is advice. Someone might have a sexual harassment complaint. Someone might have a wage underpayment. Increasingly, unions are moving away from that, and over time they're caring more about politics, more about getting their side into government so they can change the law to boost them up. So instead of earning greater coverage, they're getting their side elected to basically force themselves and their views on the population. So I don't want to sit here and be arrogant enough to give the trade union advice, but perhaps they should really have a little bit of more of an inward look and ask why their members, i.e. employees, are no longer attracted to the service they provide. Because let's be honest, that's what every other service provider in the country does, and I don't see where unions are any different.
Many thanks. It's been a great discussion. We've had two intelligent people considered arguing their case. The papers will be very important when they're published in the Sydney papers. But tonight we've had a very enlightening discussion. I've always been interested in industrial relations. I've learned a lot tonight about the current developments. So I'd like to say thanks to Ed and thanks to Jessica, and well done, and come back sometime in the future. Okay.